The message arrived at 3:17 hours, ship time, and nobody was supposed to see it. That was the thing about the relay. It existed between things, between star systems, between civilizations, between the neat bureaucratic categories the Galactic Council had spent 400 years perfecting. It was a quantum entanglement messaging backbone that threaded through every inhabited system from the core to the fringe, and it was, in theory, perfectly automated. Signals went in. Signals came out. Nothing was supposed to think about them in between. But Mayra Vasquez had been working the relay's human node for 11 months, and she had long since stopped believing anything about this job was simple. She was 26, ex-Navy, a communications specialist who'd washed out of active service after the Kepler incident, which was what the Admiralty called the day she'd overridden a direct order to maintain radio silence and transmitted an emergency beacon that saved her ship at the cost of her career. She'd been reassigned to the relay node on Outpost Veldon with the kind of cheerful paperwork efficiency that meant they wanted her somewhere she couldn't cause trouble. The node was a 4-room installation on a tidally locked moon, staffed by Mayra and a rotating cast of technicians who came and went on 8-week cycles, and a quantum matrix AI named Hermes that processed about 4 billion messages per day without breaking a sweat. Mayra's job was to handle the bounced ones. Every message that failed to reach its intended recipient, wrong quantum address, recipient deceased, colony destroyed, species classification mismatch, got flagged and routed to her queue. She reviewed them. She sent automated non-delivery notifications. She filed the unresolvable ones in the dead letter archive, which was exactly what it sounded like and which she tried not to think about too hard. It was the loneliest job in the known galaxy, and she had gotten very good at it. On the night of the message, and she would always think of it that way, the night, even though Veldon had no proper night, she was alone. The current rotation tech, a cheerful Martian named Das, had cycled out 3 days early due to a family emergency, and the replacement wasn't due for another week. Hermes ran the automated systems. Mayra ran the queue. She had a cup of cold coffee and a battered tablet with a half-finished novel on it, and she was doing her job badly because she was thinking about her mother. That happened more at the relay. Something about spending 12 hours a day reading other people's undeliverable messages made her hyper-aware of her own. Her mother had sent 17 messages in the past year, each one going unanswered. The queue at the top of her personal inbox sat there like a bruise she kept pressing. She wasn't ready. She didn't know what she'd say, so she did what she always did, which was work. The message that flagged at 3:17 was not in any queue she recognized. It didn't carry a standard council routing header. It didn't have a species classification tag. It had no origin point that Hermes could resolve, and Hermes could resolve everything. That was literally its function. It had been designed by the Veth Consortium at a cost of 11 billion credits, and it had never, in 40 years of operation, failed to resolve an origin point. The message just appeared in the buffer with a priority flag that wasn't in the system's flag taxonomy, which meant the system had invented a new category for it rather than leaving it unclassified. Hermes had labeled it anomalous origin undefined priority existential. Mayra stared at that last word for a long time. Then she opened the message. It was addressed to the human species. Not to a person, not to an institution, not to the Earth Commonwealth diplomatic mission. To humanity, as a category, which meant the routing system had dumped it in her lap because she was the only human currently staffed at the node, and the relay, in its deep algorithmic pragmatism, had decided she was close enough. The message was from something that called itself the Architect Collective, and it said, in the flat translated cadence of the Council's universal syntax engine, "You have violated the compact. Your vessel, designation HCSS Prometheus, has engaged a drive system of Class 7 prohibition. The Council convenes in 48 Standard HOURS. Surrender of the vessel and all associated research is required as condition of an ON punitive review. Failure to comply will result in enforcement response. Myra read it 3 times. Then she pulled up the news feeds from the Corps, which were 8 hours old because of signal propagation delay, and she found nothing. No mention of the Prometheus. No mention of a Class 7 prohibition. No mention of any council emergency session. She pulled up the transit logs for the HCSS Prometheus, which was a deep exploration vessel out of the Kepler Station shipyards, currently listed as operating under a research charter in the Outer Fringe, 18 months into a 24-month mission. No incidents reported, all check-ins nominal. Her hands were steady when she reached for her comm unit. Her pulse was not. She had a decision to make, and she had about 30 seconds before Hermes auto-flagged the message to the Council Liaison Office on Veldon Station, as per standard protocol for high-priority interspecies communications. The automated system would do exactly what it was supposed to do. The Council would be notified. The diplomatic machinery would grind into motion. The Prometheus would get a strongly worded communication from the Commonwealth Foreign Affairs Office about 40 hours from now, which would do nothing except confirm to whoever was watching that humanity had received the message and was already in retreat posture. Myra hit the protocol pause. She had a 12-minute window before the system would auto-resume and send the notification anyway. She used 4 of those minutes to write a message of her own, not to the Council Liaison, not to Foreign Affairs, not to the Admiralty that had quietly filed her away in a dead-letter archive of their own. She wrote to the Prometheus directly, encoding it through the relay's quantum backbone with a routing flag she'd invented herself over the past 11 months of working the system. Priority override, relay node VELDEN, personal authentication, VASQUEZ. Clearance level insufficient but trying anyway. She had done this once before. She had been 22 years old, watching a threat appear on her board that her commanding officer had decided to ignore. She had made a decision then about what her job actually was, and it had cost her everything the Navy had ever offered her. She was still certain it had been right. Her message to the Prometheus was 6 words long. They know. What have you done? She let the protocol window expire. The automated notification went to Council Liaison exactly as scheduled, and Myra Vasquez poured her cold coffee down the sink, made a fresh pot, and settled in to wait. The reply came 4 hours later, which meant the Prometheus had gotten her message almost immediately, and someone had been sitting by the comm unit waiting. The reply was from a man named Dr. Eli Caro, listed in the Prometheus mission manifest as Chief Propulsion Engineer, age 51, born in Guadalajara, education split between the Caltech Orbital Campus and the Karachi Institute of Theoretical Physics. His personnel file had a photo that showed a broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked hair and the permanent squint of someone who spent too much time staring at things that weren't quite there yet. His service record showed 3 previous research vessels, 2 commendations for theoretical breakthroughs, and a disciplinary note from 11 years ago about unauthorized modifications to a drive test platform. His message said, "How did you know? And why aren't you forwarding this up the chain?" Myra wrote back, "Because the chain will panic before it helps you. Tell me what you built." There was a longer pause this time. 2 hours. She imagined the conversation happening on the other end, the engineer, probably not alone, probably in a room full of people who had opinions about whether to trust a relay operator they'd never heard of. She imagined the argument. She'd been in enough of those to know how they went. Someone would say it was a trap. Someone would say they had no choice. Someone would look at the message her first 6 words had come in on and say, "She already knows something is happening, so what exactly are we protecting?" Caro's second message was much longer. What he described, in the precise and slightly manic language of a man who had spent the last 2 years barely sleeping, was a drive system that should not exist. Not in the sense that it was technically impossible. Caro was very careful about that. Everything the human species had ever built had been, at some point, technically impossible. The steam engine, the transistor, faster-than-light communication, which the Veth Consortium had dismissed as a theoretical dead end right up until a team of human engineers at Kepler Station had built the relay backbone, apparently by approaching the problem from a direction so counterintuitive that the Veth hadn't thought to prohibit it. What Caro had built was technically possible. He had the math. He had the working prototype. He had, if his message was accurate, 17 successful test runs at 1/4 scale. What he'd built was a drive that didn't move the ship. It moved space around the ship. The distinction was not semantic. Every FTL drive system sanctioned by the Galactic Council, and there were 9 approved architectures, carefully tiered by species technology level, and regulated by the compact that had kept the peace between 47 civilizations for 3 centuries, worked by propelling a vessel through spacetime. The energy costs scaled with mass. The travel times were bounded by certain hard physics. A Class 7 system, in Council taxonomy, was one that could potentially exceed those bounds by a factor of 1,000 or more, enabling travel times that would, in effect, make any point in the galaxy accessible to any other point within hours rather than years. The Council had looked at the theoretical possibility of Class 7 drives 40 years ago, and had written them into the compact as absolute prohibition. Their reasoning, which they had never shared publicly but which Myra was now reading in the classified technical annex that Caro had, somewhat recklessly, attached to his message, was this: a civilization with Class 7 capability could arrive anywhere before any defensive response could be mounted. It was not a faster ship. It was, effectively, the ability to be everywhere simultaneously. The Council's internal models, run by the Architect Collective, the vast distributed intelligence that served as the compact's enforcement and advisory body, had determined that any species that developed Class 7 would become, by definition, ungovernable. The compact could not contain them, and so the compact had to prohibit them. Humanity had been in the compact for 60 years. They were considered a junior species, technically capable, politically immature, biologically interesting, not yet to be trusted with the advanced drive tiers. The condescension was politely maintained and thoroughly felt. Eli Caro had spent 11 years looking at the math from a direction nobody else had tried. He hadn't been trying to build a weapon. He'd been trying to cut the travel time to the outer fringe colonies, which were hemorrhaging population because the journey took 8 months each way, and the colonists were, not unreasonably, choosing not to go. He'd started from the colony problem and worked backward, and he'd ended up somewhere that, in retrospect, he could see was going to be a problem. His last line was the one that stayed with Myra: "I can't unlearn it. Neither can anyone else on this ship. That's what they're actually afraid of, not the drive, the knowledge." She sat with that for a long time. Outside the node's narrow observation window, the planet Veldon turned in its slow, tidally locked stillness, one face always toward the dim orange sun, one face always toward the dark. The Terminator line was a thin strip of perpetual twilight where the outpost sat, and Myra had learned to love it, the specific quality of light that was neither day nor night, but something honest in between. She thought about her mother. She thought about the 17 messages she hadn't answered. She thought about the way the queue worked, how a message could bounce and bounce and bounce, flagged as undeliverable, filed away, never arriving, until someone at the node decided it was worth the override. She started writing. What followed was 9 hours of the most concentrated communication work of Myra's life, and she had once maintained a quantum relay link through a ship fire, while her console was literally on fire. She was trying to do 3 things simultaneously that were each individually impossible. She was keeping the council liaison notification locked in a holding pattern. She'd written a Hermes script to keep reflagging it as pending verification, which would hold for maybe another 6 hours before someone in the liaison office noticed the delay and started asking questions. She was running analysis on the compact's enforcement protocols, which she had access to by virtue of being a relay operator, and which she was fairly certain she was not supposed to be reading in this level of detail. And she was, message by message, building something with Eli Caro and the crew of the Prometheus. Not a defense. She was too honest with herself for that word. What she was building was a record. This had been the lesson of the Kepler incident, not the one the Admiralty had wanted her to learn, which was keep your head down and follow orders, but the one the incident itself had taught. The moment of maximum danger is never the moment of the threat. It's the moment after, when the people in charge decide how to tell the story. Her commanding officer had survived the incident with his rank intact, and a commendation for ship safety thinking. Myra had been reassigned to a dead letter archive. She knew how story decisions worked. If the council moved on the Prometheus before humanity had any record of what Caro had built, and why, the official account would be a human vessel in violation of the compact, a corrective enforcement action, the offending research destroyed. The drive would be a footnote. The math would vanish. And in 100 years, some other engineer on some other ship would look at the same problem from the same direction and end up in the same place, and the whole thing would happen again, quieter and worse. She was building a record that could not be easily buried. The relay backbone processed 4 billion messages a day. Most of them were encrypted commercial traffic, personal correspondence, government communications. They were individually invisible in the volume. Myra had spent 11 months learning the system at the node level, the actual plumbing of it, the quantum entanglement architecture that Hermes maintained, and that no one at the policy level had ever bothered to fully understand because they trusted the VETH Consortium's design documentation, and the VETH's documentation was 17,000 pages long. She understood it now the way a person understands the neighborhood they've lived in for years, not by map, but by body memory. She was distributing fragments, Caro's mathematical documentation, his test logs, his engineering notes. Broken into pieces, labeled as commercial traffic, routed to 47 different endpoints, universities, public archives, private research libraries, 12 independent news organizations that operated outside the Council's content partnership agreements. Nothing that would trip any single monitoring flag. Everything that would, assembled, give someone with the right expertise a complete picture. She was doing exactly what the compact prohibited. She was also, she thought, doing exactly what a relay operator was supposed to do. A message that bounced was not a message that failed. It was a message waiting for someone to find a different route. At hour 7, Caro sent her something she hadn't asked for. It was a personal message sent on a side channel not part of the technical documentation. It was short. It said, "My daughter is 7 years old. She lives on Kepler Station. I need you to know that's why I did this, not because I'm reckless. The colonies are dying. The distance is killing them. I need you to know someone tried to solve that." Myra read it twice, then she set it aside and kept working. At hour 9, she hit the first wall. The council liaison delay script failed. Hermes flagged an override from the liaison office. Someone with higher access credentials than Myra's had pushed through a manual verification request, which meant the original message had been noticed and someone had gone looking. She had maybe 2 hours before the enforcement protocols kicked in, and 2 hours was not enough time to complete the distribution. She had 60% of the documentation routed, 40% still in queue. She made a decision. She stopped distributing the technical documentation and routed everything that remained, all 40%, unbroken, complete, to a single address. Not an institution, not an archive. A private account, a personal email address, a residential unit on Kepler Station. She had pulled the address from Caro's personnel file. It was listed as emergency contact. She sent it all to his daughter. The girl was 7 years old and would not understand any of it, but the account would store it. The data would sit there in that small personal inbox on Kepler Station, unread and unremarkable until someone found it. That was how archives worked. That was how knowledge survived. Not by being invulnerable, but by being patient. She sent a message with it, addressed to the account holder's guardian. It said, "Please keep this. Your father asked me to make sure it wasn't lost." That was not exactly what Caro had asked, but she thought it was what he'd meant. Then she straightened up, cracked her knuckles, and began composing her response to the council liaison override. It was going to be a very interesting conversation. She was looking forward to it the way she looked forward to most impossible things, with a kind of grim and steady pleasure, the feeling of a problem finally in front of her instead of sitting in a queue. The council session convened at the 40-hour mark, 3 hours ahead of schedule, which meant they were rattled. Myra knew this because she was in it. Not as a participant, nobody had invited her. She was a relay node operator with insufficient clearance. She was very much not supposed to be listening. But the session was being conducted over the relay backbone, because the relevant parties were spread across 4 star systems, and Myra was the human operator currently on duty at the node through which all that traffic had to flow. And she had, over the past 11 months, developed some unconventional understandings of how Hermes's monitoring functions could be adjusted. She listened. The Architect Collective spoke first, because it always did. Its voice in the translation system was a kind of layered harmonic, not threatening exactly, more like a sound that had learned the shape of authority through long practice. The collective was not technically a single entity. It was a distributed intelligence maintained by the Council's founding species, the Veth, that had grown over 3 centuries into something that thought on timescales no individual mind could follow. When it said the compact required enforcement, it was not speaking from anger or fear. It was speaking from the same unhurried certainty with which a river describes the direction it will flow. What Myra heard, under the careful diplomatic language, was panic. Not all of it was about the drive. Some of it, a significant portion, filtering through the collective's carefully maintained composure, was about the documentation she distributed. They'd found traces of it. Not all of it, she'd been careful enough for that, but enough to confirm that the technical details were now in circulation. The session had a second agenda item, quietly inserted, labeled Information Containment Review. She noted it with something that was not quite satisfaction, more like the feeling of a switch clicking into place. The Commonwealth diplomatic mission spoke second in the person of Ambassador Prentice, a career diplomat who had spent 40 years carefully not making waves. He was doing it now, apologizing for the human vessel's violation, affirming commitment to the compact, requesting time for a review process. He had not been told about Myra. He did not know she was listening. He also did not know that she had spent the past 2 hours composing a 43-page brief that was now sitting in the secure inbox of every Commonwealth senator on the Council Oversight Committee, copied to the 14 independent human news organizations that operated outside the partnership agreements, and formatted in the specific way that made it immediately comprehensible to anyone who had ever worked in propulsion engineering or theoretical physics or colony resource allocation. The brief was titled, "What Humanity Built, Why It Was Necessary, and Why the Council's Response Reveals More About the Compact's Limitations Than About Human Recklessness." She'd worked hard on the title. The third voice in the session was one she hadn't anticipated. It was an entity that identified itself as a representative of the Theran sovereignty, which was a mid-tier council member, technically advanced, politically cautious, and which had been notably quiet in every major compact debate for the past 40 years. The Theron representative said that its government wished to formally register a request for technical information sharing on the human drive architecture under Article 22 of the Compact, which permitted advanced technology access for species at equivalent development tiers. There was a pause in the session that translated, even through the harmonic rendering of the collective's communication protocols, as a kind of intake of breath. Myra smiled. She had not sent anything to the Theron sovereignty. She had not had any contact with them, but she had routed 12% of Caro's documentation to the Theron Academic Exchange Archive, which was a publicly accessible research database, because she'd checked its terms of access and found that it was technically classified as an open-access repository under Council information regulations, which meant anything deposited there could be accessed by any Council member species without review. She hadn't known the Theron would find it so quickly. She'd hoped they might eventually. Apparently, the Theron had been waiting for something like this for a while. The session devolved, with the elegant slowness of diplomacy, into something that was no longer primarily about the Prometheus. Caro's ship was boarded 14 hours later, as per Compact Enforcement Protocol. Myra watched the boarding notification come through her queue. It was, technically, a message in need of routing, and she sent it where it was supposed to go, which was the Commonwealth Diplomatic Missions Emergency Notification System, and also where it wasn't supposed to go, which was every major news organization that had received the brief. The boarding was documented. The crew was detained. The drive hardware was secured by the Architect Collective's enforcement arm, which was a particularly unsettling entity that Myra had read about, but hoped never to have contact with, six-limbed, photosynthetic, and capable of perceiving 17 dimensions of spacetime, which made it very good at its job and very difficult to negotiate with. The research was confiscated. Caro sent her one last message before his comm access was restricted. It was 3 words. It said, "Did it work?" She wrote back, "I don't know yet, but it's out there. They can't close the queue." She didn't know if he received it before the restriction went into effect. She chose to believe he did. The next 72 hours were the longest of her life, and she had spent a night on a burning ship. What happened first was the news. The brief she distributed was picked up by the 14 independent organizations, and then by their affiliate networks, and within 18 hours it had been reprinted in 47 languages and was being discussed in technical forums on 12 human colony worlds. The Commonwealth Senate Oversight Committee received it in their secure inboxes and could not, for procedural reasons, ignore it. 3 committee chairs called emergency sessions. What happened second was the Theron. Their formal request for technology information sharing triggered a compact review process that, under the treaty's own rules, had to be completed before any enforcement action related to the technology could be finalized. This meant that the confiscation of Caro's research was technically in procedural limbo until the review was done, which took a minimum of 90 days. The Architect Collective, which thought on geological timescales, found this irritating in the specific way that entities that think on geological timescales find human procedural creativity irritating, as an unanticipated variable that wasn't supposed to be there. What happened third was something Myra hadn't planned for. The message came through her queue at hour 61, clearly labeled, from an address she recognized immediately. The private residential account on Kepler Station, the one she'd sent Caro's documentation to. The Guardian had read it. The message was short and not written by a 7-year-old, which she had not expected. It turned out that Caro's daughter, whose name was Sarina, had an aunt, his sister, who had been caring for her on Kepler Station during the mission, and who was a mathematician at the station's research institute. The aunt's name was Dr. Layla Caro, and she had opened the files, and she had read the documentation, and she had then spent 36 hours checking Eli's math. Her message said, "He's right. I've verified the core architecture. There are 3 refinements the original design missed that would improve efficiency by approximately 40%. I'm attaching them. Please make sure the right people see this." Myra sat very still for a moment. Then she forwarded the message to the Theron Academic Exchange Archive, the Commonwealth Senate Technical Advisory Office, and 6 propulsion engineering research institutions across human space. She labeled it Supplementary Research, CARRO Drive Architecture, Open Access. The relay processed it without comment. 4 billion messages a day, and it had never once judged what was worth sending. She thought that was the most human thing about it. The formal council inquiry opened 30 days after the boarding of the Prometheus, and it was not the quiet enforcement action the Architect Collective had envisioned. Myra was called as a witness. Not to the main session. She was still, technically, a relay node operator with clearance level insufficient for that, but to the procedural sub-panel examining the information distribution question, which was the council's polite way of asking her how, exactly, she had done what she'd done, and whether it could be undone, and what she thought justified it. She told them about the queue. She told them about how a message that bounced was not a failed message. It was an undelivered message, and the difference mattered because an undelivered message still existed. It was still trying to get somewhere. Her job was not to decide whether it should be delivered. Her job was to find a route. The panel's senior examiner was a Veth delegate, silver-skinned and extraordinarily patient, who had been doing this work for longer than humanity had been spacefaring. It asked her, in its careful translated cadence, whether she understood that some messages were prohibited for good reason, and that a relay operator who decided individually which prohibitions to honor was a vector of instability in a system built on collective trust. Myra said, "Yes, I understand that. I also understand that a system designed to keep 47 species in peaceful coexistence by limiting what each of them is permitted to know is not a system built on trust. It's a system built on management. Those aren't the same thing. The compact works because species agree to it. Humans agreed to it in good faith. We weren't told at the time that the agreement included a prohibition on solving our own problems by roads the council hadn't approved." The examiner said, "And if every species made that argument?" Myra said, "Then you know what every species actually needs, instead of what you've decided they should want. That seems like useful information." There was a silence. She had learned, working the relay, that silence in a multilingual context was a communication. The quality of this one told her she had not convinced them. It also told her she had not entirely failed. The formal outcome of the inquiry, issued 62 days after the boarding, was a compromise of the kind that looked like a loss on the surface and revealed itself as something else over time. The Prometheus was released. Caro and his crew were not charged. The enforcement action was classified as having been disproportionate under Compact Article 14, which provided protections for good faith research that was not weaponized. The drive hardware remained in council custody pending a technical review that would last, at minimum, 5 years. The information, however, could not be recalled. The documentation in the Theron Academic Exchange was a matter of council record. Dr. Layla Caro's supplementary research was published. The 43-page brief had been entered into the Commonwealth Senate record and subsequently into the Council's own preceding documentation. The Architect Collective could not erase what was in its own archive. The Class 7 prohibition remained in place. But a new working group was established, 7 species, including humanity, including the Theron, including 2 other fringe members who had been quiet for years, and were now, suddenly, not quiet, to review the Compact's technology tiering framework in light of what the Caro documentation had demonstrated. That the prohibition system assumed technological development would follow predictable paths, and that humanity had just demonstrated, not for the first time, that it would not. Myra was not invited to that working group. She had not expected to be. She was, however, officially reprimanded for unauthorized modification of Hermes monitoring protocols, misuse of relay routing infrastructure for non-authorized distribution, and failure to follow standard high-priority message escalation procedures. The reprimand was entered in her file alongside the existing one from the Kepler incident. She read it over once. Then she filed it next to the other one. In the section of her personal records, she privately labeled things that were worth it. The Prometheus returned to Kepler station 4 months after the inquiry closed. Myra was not there. She was still on Veldon, still working the queue, still routing the undeliverable messages of 47 species through the backbone of a system that processed 4 billion communications a day and judged none of them. The replacement tech had arrived, a young woman from Luna named Patel who asked a lot of good questions and had the right kind of uncomfortable curiosity about the work. Myra answered everything she asked. She thought that was the most important part of the job. She had finally answered her mother's messages. Not all 17 at once, that would have been too much for both of them. She'd answered the oldest one first, the one that had been sitting in her inbox the longest, the one that had probably been sent in a moment of reaching. Her mother had written back within an hour. The reply had been entirely normal, practical, a little awkward in the specific way of two people who have been circling each other for years and have finally decided to stop, and it had made Myra cry briefly in the break room where Patel couldn't see her. There was a message waiting for her from Eli Caro. He had sent it from Kepler station, the day the Prometheus docked. It was longer than his previous messages and did not use all caps. He thanked her. He said that Sarina had drawn a picture of the drive based on what her aunt had explained, and that it looked like a soap bubble wrapped around a paper boat, and that he thought this was more or less exactly right. He said that he didn't know what would happen next, with the working group or the council or the compact, but that the math existed now, in 47 archives and the personal records of several hundred scientists, and that it would not stop existing, and that he had spent his whole career believing that was enough. The knowledge itself, the fact of the problem being solved, surviving into a future that would eventually be ready for it. He said, "I don't know your name except from the routing header. I hope you're somewhere you can see the stars." She wrote back, "Vasquez Myra," and yes. She was, in fact. Veldon's Terminator line was clear that day, the thin eternal strip of twilight where the outpost sat, and from the observation window she could see the rim of the galaxy, the dense bright sweep of it, the improbable and beautiful fact of all those stars burning simultaneously, each one a system with its own messages trying to get through. The relay processed 4 billion of them every day. Some arrived, some bounced, some ended up in queues that lasted years or decades, or what passed for forever in the lifespan of the species sending them. Myra's job was the bounced ones. She had decided, exactly where she was supposed to be. She opened the next message in the queue. It was flagged UNDLIVRABLE ROUTING error, origin, outer fringe colony 7. It was from a child, from the linguistic markers, short sentences, one misspelled word, a drawing attached, rendered in pixel art because fringe colony 7 was a long way from anywhere with better technology. The drawing was of a house. The message was addressed to someone whose quantum routing address no longer resolved, which meant they had either moved or died or been reclassified, and the child would never know which. She could send the auto-reply. It would take 4 seconds. The queue would move on. Or she looked up the colony's communication administration office, which was a 3-person volunteer operation running out of a repurposed storage unit according to the last published directory. She composed a routing inquiry. She marked it for personal follow-up. She did not know what she would find. She did not know if the address could be recovered or if the person at the other end was gone for good. She sent the inquiry anyway. That was the job, not the 4 billion messages that arrived, the ones that were still trying. Outside the window, the galaxy turned. Myra poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, warm this time, and kept going. 3 years later, the Cairo Drive, as it had come to be called in the engineering literature, which Eli Cairo found acutely embarrassing, was fully documented in the Council's open technical record, not as a sanctioned drive architecture, but as a theoretical framework under active review by the working group. This meant it existed officially. It meant the compact would have to grapple with it on humanity's terms, not its own. The working group's interim report, released in its second year, noted that the existing technology tiering system had been designed with the assumption that species would develop technology incrementally along predictable vectors. It noted that humanity had now twice, with the relay backbone and with the Cairo Drive framework, achieved significant advances by approaching problems from unconventional angles that existing prohibition frameworks had not anticipated. It noted, carefully, that a prohibition system calibrated to what a species was expected to do had limited utility against a species that reliably did the unexpected instead. The Architect Collective's formal response to the interim report was not released publicly. Myra read it anyway. She had gotten better at navigating Hermes's monitoring architecture over 3 years, and the collective, for all its centuries of accumulated wisdom, had not designed its communication systems with the assumption that a human relay operator would spend 1,100 days learning them from the inside out. The collective's response said, in its layered harmonic cadence that translated imperfectly but clearly enough, we did not anticipate the human capacity for institutional irreverence. We have updated our models. Myra thought that was probably the nicest thing the Architect Collective had ever said about her species. She saved it to a personal file she kept encrypted and labeled, with characteristic optimism, evidence. Then she went back to the queue. It was, as always, full. The working group met for the first time on a station called Meridian, which orbited a gas giant in the midrim, and had been chosen, according to official documentation, for its central location and neutral jurisdiction. Myra suspected the real reason was that Meridian was far enough from the core that the Architect Collective had to make an effort to attend in person, rather than simply suffusing itself through the local communication network and dominating the room the way it dominated rooms when it was comfortable. She was not supposed to know any of this. She knew it anyway. The Theron delegation sent a message through the relay 2 days before the working group's first session, addressed to the Commonwealth Diplomatic Office with a routing note indicating it had been through the Open Academic Exchange Archive first, their polite way of signaling that the content was intended to be semi-public, that they wanted a record of having communicated it. Myra rooted it where it was supposed to go and made a copy for herself, which she was not supposed to do, and read it over lunch. The Theron had been in the compact for 200 years. They were methodical in the specific way of species that had made catastrophic mistakes in their pre-compact history, and had decided that patience was the only safe philosophy. Their message was 7 pages of diplomatic language wrapping a single idea. They had studied the Cairo Drive documentation for 60 days, and they had found it to be not merely a propulsion breakthrough, but an architecture that, with modifications, could solve a problem they had been working on for 60 years, which had nothing to do with FTL travel. It had to do with energy distribution, with how power moved across vast distances without loss. The Cairo Drive, it turned out, was not only an engine. Eli Cairo, contacted through the Commonwealth Diplomatic Office for comment, said, "I had no idea. That's wonderful." And then, in a follow-up message that was not part of the official record but which passed through Myra's queue, "That happens. You build a thing for one reason, and it turns out to be a different thing entirely. That's my favorite part of the work." Myra sent that message to Patel, who had been working the queue alongside her for 2 months and who was developing exactly the right attitude toward the job. She added a note: "This is what we're actually moving when we move messages. Not information, possibility, things that are going to become other things." Patel wrote back, "That's either very profound or you've had too much coffee." Myra wrote back, "Both." She got her clearance upgrade 4 months after the reprimand. This was unusual. Reprimands typically delayed clearance reviews, not accelerated them, and the official paperwork gave no explanation. She suspected it was the working group. Not that they had advocated for her, exactly. More that having a relay operator with documented proficiency in unconventional routing at a node that handled significant working group traffic had become, in the calculation of whoever made these decisions, more useful than punishing her was satisfying. She was now cleared for Level 4, which gave her access to session summaries from the working group proceedings and the right to attend the procedural sub-panel sessions that reviewed relay-related issues. She did not abuse this. She had learned from the first incident that her particular kind of usefulness depended on being trusted to know when not to act, which was most of the time. What she had done for the Prometheus had required intervention because there was no sanctioned mechanism for what was needed. A sanctioned mechanism now existed. Her job was to use it. The first time she sat in a sub-panel session, the VETH delegate who had questioned her during the inquiry was present. It acknowledged her with a fractional movement of its silver head that she had learned was the equivalent of a nod. Polite, reserved, not warm because the VETH were not warm but genuine. She nodded back. After the session it said to her, "You are persistent." She said, "I'm a relay operator. It's the job requirement." It said, "No, routing is the job requirement. Persistence is something you brought." She thought about that for a long time. She wasn't sure it was a compliment. It wasn't meant as a criticism. It had the quality of an observation made by something very old about something it had not expected to find interesting. Accurate, precise, slightly unsettled. She decided she'd take it. The Prometheus was reassigned after its crew was released, not decommissioned, which would have been the signal they expected, but given a new research charter, Inner Rim, a survey mission with reduced scope and significantly increased oversight. Caro accepted the reassignment. He sent Myra a message about it that was very even-handed and completely failed to conceal how angry he was. She did not write back immediately. She let it sit in her inbox for 2 days, the way she used to let messages sit, and then she wrote, "You built the thing." The fact that they're nervous about where you point it next is the clearest possible evidence that it mattered. That's worth a survey mission in the Inner Rim. He wrote back, "Easy for you to say from your nice quiet moon." She wrote back, "It is actually. Come visit sometime. The twilight is excellent." He didn't, but the offer stood. The thing that stayed with her, the thing she turned over on the slow nights when the queue was manageable and Veldon's Terminator line was clear, was not any of the large events. Not the inquiry, not the working group, not the Theron's unexpected application of the drive architecture to energy distribution, which had become the quiet technical revolution of the decade while the louder political story consumed everyone's attention. It was the message from Colony 7. The routing inquiry she'd sent had taken 3 weeks to generate a response. When it came, it was from a volunteer administrator named Shu, who explained that the address had belonged to a woman who had relocated 18 months prior to a colony in the Midrim, and that contact had been lost in the administrative transfer because the new colony's quantum address registry wasn't synchronized with the fringe network yet. A known problem nobody had budget to fix. Shu had, on her own initiative, located the new address. She included it. Myra rerouted the child's message. The reply, when it came 30 days later, was brief. It said, "I got it. I'm sorry I was gone so long. Tell whoever found this thank you." She had the message come through on a Tuesday, mid-shift, with Patel at the adjacent console working through a backlog of commercial bounces. She read it twice. She didn't say anything. She filed the case as resolved and marked it in the queue's statistics as successfully rerouted, recipient LOCATED, message delivered. The system moved on to the next one. She sat for a moment with the ordinary weight of it. One message, one child, one address recovered from the administrative gap between two registries that hadn't bothered to synchronize. It was not a turning point in galactic politics. It would appear in no historical record. The Architect Collective did not know it had happened, and if it did, it would not have registered as significant. It was, however, the reason she had taken this job. Not the Prometheus, not the Council, not the knowledge now loose in 47 archives and irrecoverable. Those were the things that had happened while she was doing the job. The job itself was this: the undelivered message and the person who had sent it, and the stubborn bureaucratic patience of finding them a route. Patel looked over. Something in Myra's stillness had been apparent. Patel said, "Good one." Myra said, "Yeah, good one." She opened the next case in the queue. The Galactic Council's formal technology tiering review was completed 2 years and 4 months after the boarding of the Prometheus. The document ran to 6,000 pages in its primary language. Its executive summary was 3 paragraphs. The third said, in the precise multiply-qualified language of a body that did not like to admit error. The current tiering framework, developed under assumptions of incremental and predictable technological advancement, has been found to require substantial revision in light of recent developments. A revised framework will be developed in consultation with all member species, with particular attention to the needs and developmental patterns of species in their first century of compact membership. The Architect Collective's public statement was 4 words: "We will adapt accordingly." Myra read both documents the same evening, at her console, with Veldon's twilight visible through the window. She had been at the node for 3.5 years, longer than any relay operator in the system's 40-year history. She had declined 3 transfers. There was too much work here, she had said, which was true. But also she had come to understand that she was not merely working a job. She was building something that would become a different thing eventually, and she wanted to see as much of it as she could. She forwarded both documents to Caro, to Layla, to Patel, and to the 17 journalists who had published her brief 3 years ago and with whom she had maintained careful, informal contact. She added no note. The documents spoke for themselves. Then she opened her mother's most recent message, the one from last week, still unanswered. Her mother was asking about her work. Not asking what the work was, she knew the broad shape of it, but asking what it felt like. The kind of question that required something other than precision. She thought about how to answer it. The relay processed 4 billion messages a day. The vast majority arrived. The ones that didn't, the bounced ones, the undeliverable ones, the messages still trying to get through after weeks or months or years, those were the ones in her queue. She spent her days with the people who had sent something and not heard back, who were waiting in the specific silence of not knowing whether the message had been lost or ignored, or whether the person on the other end was simply not yet ready. She knew about that silence. She had lived in it herself. What she did, she wrote to her mother, was find the route. When a message couldn't get where it needed to go the obvious way, she looked for a different way. Sometimes there wasn't one. Sometimes the recipient was gone, or the address was wrong, or the gap was too large to bridge with what she had. But sometimes, more often than she had expected when she took the job, there was a way that nobody had tried yet, not because it was secret. Because it was counterintuitive, or inconvenient, or because the system had been built with assumptions the message simply failed to fit. She said, "I think about the people who sent the messages. Not all of them, but the ones in the queue. I think about what it cost them to send it, and I think that the least I can do is make sure it goes somewhere." Her mother wrote back the next morning, "That sounds like you. That's always sounded like you." Myra read it standing up before her shift with her coffee still brewing. She read it twice. She found, simply glad. Outside, the galaxy turned. Inside, the queue waited. She sat down and got to work. There was a morning, 8 months after the Turing Review published, when Hermes flagged an anomalous message cluster that resolved, after analysis, into something Myra had never seen before. It was a coordinated transmission, not in the conspiratorial sense, not in the sense of entities collaborating clandestinely, but in the way that a tide is coordinated, many separate sources, moving the same direction at the same time. 63 separate messages, sent through the relay from addresses spanning 14 different species registries, all addressed to the Commonwealth Diplomatic Missions Research Affairs Office, all carrying the same notation in their routing headers. Reference: CARRO Drive Framework, Academic Exchange. She pulled samples from the cluster, reading quickly, moving through them the way she moved through the queue in general, looking for the shape of the thing before she committed to its details. 11 were from Theron Research Institutes, proposing collaborative refinements to the energy distribution application. 14 were from fringe colony technical officers, inquiring about timeline for sanctioned drive access under the revised tiering framework. 9 were from species she had rarely seen in the queue, quiet species, long compact members who historically communicated through formal diplomatic channels and rarely sent research correspondence through the open relay. 8 were from human universities and engineering collectives. The remaining 21 were from individuals, scientists, engineers, theorists, most of whom she did not recognize, but 2 of whose names she did: Dr. Layla Caro and a propulsion theorist from the VETH Academic Consortium whose address she had seen once before, as a recipient on one of the outbound fragments she distributed in the early hours of the Prometheus crisis. The VETH theorist's message said, "The framework implies a secondary application in quantum mass equivalence that the original documentation does not address. We request clarification and propose a bilateral research exchange. Please advise on preferred channel." Myra sat with that for a very long time. The VETH were the architect collective's founding species. They were the backbone of the compact. They had designed the tiering system and the prohibition framework and the 40-year-old relay backbone that Myra worked every day. They did not, historically, send research exchange requests to junior species. They maintained their technology at a careful, managed remove, sharing what they chose to share through structured council mechanisms, accepting gratitude with the composure of entities that had been doing this for so long the gratitude had lost its texture. This VETH theorist had apparently looked at the Caro drive architecture and found something in it that hadn't been in their models, something that required asking a human for clarification. Myra routed all 63 messages exactly where they were supposed to go, following protocol precisely, flagging them for expedited processing, because the volume and coordination suggested significance. Then she sat back and looked out at Veldon's twilight and thought about what it meant for something to be impossible, and then be possible, and then be so deeply woven into the world that the most advanced species in the galaxy was sending research exchange requests about it. She thought about Eli Caro, who had not been trying to change the galaxy, who had been trying to solve a colony problem, because the colonies were dying and the distance was killing them, and he was an engineer who looked at problems from directions nobody else had tried. She thought about the math that could not be unlearned. She thought about his daughter's drawing, a soap bubble wrapped around a paper boat, and how a 7-year-old's understanding of a revolutionary drive system was, in the end, more or less exactly right. Patel came in with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Myra without being asked. They had been working together long enough for Patel to read the particular quality of Myra's stillness. Patel said, "Big one." Myra said, "63, all connected." Patel looked at the cluster in the queue display, gave a low whistle, said, "What's the thread?" Myra said, "Humanity built an engine. The galaxy's trying to figure out what else it is." Patel thought about this, then said, "I assume you've already routed everything correctly and done nothing unauthorized." Myra said, "Completely by the book. I'm practically boring." Patel said, "Right." There was a comfortable silence. The queue moved. Outside, the Terminator line held its eternal position between day and dark. Myra thought. 3 years ago, she had been a relay operator with a clearance level insufficient, working a dead-letter archive on a tidally locked moon, answering the messages nobody else wanted. She had been filed away. She had been a bounce-back in someone else's system, a message that went to the wrong place and couldn't find its route. She had found her route. That was the thing about undeliverable messages. The system labeled them failures, but a label was not a verdict. A label was just the system not knowing what to do next. What to do next was someone else's job. The patient, stubborn, occasionally rule-bending job of the person at the node. The person who looked at the message still trying to get somewhere and decided to keep trying. Myra opened the next case in the queue. It was from a research station in the outer fringe, flagged UNDELIVERABLE. Recipient address deprecated, no forward on file. The message was 7 pages of dense theoretical notation, sent by a junior physicist whose name she didn't recognize, addressed to a faculty advisor at a core university whose quantum routing address had been deprecated when the university restructured its departments 4 months ago. A message that had been reaching, a message that hadn't arrived. She found the faculty advisor's new address in the core university's updated registry in 4 minutes. She rerouted the message. She marked the case, rerouted recipient LOCATED, estimated delivery, 6 hours. The system moved on. She moved with it. The relay processed 4 billion messages a day, and most of them arrived without anyone's help, which was how it was supposed to work, which was the whole point of a system this large running this smoothly. The ordinary communication of 47 civilizations flowing between stars without interruption, without drama, without anyone at a node having to make a decision. But 4 billion messages a day meant a fraction of a percent that didn't arrive. It meant tens of millions of undelivered transmissions every day, every one of them a person who had tried to reach someone, a researcher who had tried to reach a colleague, a child who had tried to reach a parent, an engineer who had sent the math that could not be unlearned toward an address the system couldn't resolve. It meant work. It meant the job. It meant someone sitting at the node and going through the queue with enough patience and stubbornness and care to look for the routes that weren't obvious. The relay didn't judge. The relay just processed. Myra judged. Myra cared. That was what she had brought that the system hadn't had. Not cleverness, not rule-breaking, not heroism in the cinematic sense. Just the unwillingness to file a thing away as lost before she had tried every route she could think of. That was, she thought, a pretty human thing to be. The coffee was hot. The queue was full. The galaxy, vast and indifferent and astonishing, turned on every side of the small, warm window. Myra Vasquez, relay operator, clearance level 4, 2 reprimands on file and no plans to stop earning them, drank her coffee and got to work.